I never meant for that night to matter. If anything, I told myself it was temporary, an inconvenience solved by a neighbor's kindness. But when I think back to the moment I stepped into Daniel Reed's apartment, suitcase in hand, I realize the shift had already begun long before the door closed behind me. Mark Sullivan and I had been together for 4 years. 4 years sounded solid when said aloud, like something built to last. From the outside, we looked stable, shared rent, shared routines, shared friends who assumed we would eventually share a last name. But stability is not the same as closeness. Somewhere between Mark's promotions and my quiet attempts to keep us connected, something fragile had thinned. Mark worked late most evenings, his ambition sharpening as his affection dulled. He didn't mean to neglect me, that was the part that made it harder to resent him. He believed providing comfort was enough, new furniture, dinners out when his schedule allowed, brief apologies whispered before sleep. But apologies without change are just repetitions. I stopped asking for more because asking made me feel needy, and I hated feeling that way. Daniel Reed moved in next door 6 months earlier. He introduced himself with an easy smile and a handshake that lingered half a second longer than necessary. He had a calm presence, the kind that made hallways feel less narrow. At first, we exchanged nothing more than polite greetings. Then came small conversations, about the unreliable elevator, about the cafe on the corner, about the quiet strangeness of living alone. Daniel lived alone because he'd recently ended a long-term relationship. He didn't overshare, but I could sense the bruise beneath his composure. There was something disarming about the way he listened. When I spoke, he didn't glance at his phone or interrupt to redirect the topic. He held eye contact as if my words were deliberate, as if they mattered. The first time I noticed the difference between Daniel and Mark was a Tuesday evening. Mark had cancelled dinner again, stuck at the office. I stood in the hallway holding takeout for 2 when Daniel stepped out to collect his mail. He asked how my night was going. I told him, lightly, that plans change. He studied my face for a moment longer than comfort allowed and said, "You don't look like someone whose plans just changed. You look disappointed." It startled me, not because he was wrong, but because he saw it. Mark hadn't seen it in months. I dismissed the thought as projection. It was easier to believe I was reading too much into harmless attention than to admit I was starving for it. The situation that pushed everything forward felt almost mundane. 2 nights before Mark's scheduled business trip, our bathroom pipes burst without warning. Water pulled across the tiles, seeping into the hallway. The landlord promised repairs, but they would take days. Mark, already distracted by his upcoming presentation, muttered something about booking me a cheap hotel while he was gone. I nodded, though the idea of sleeping alone in a sterile room felt heavier than it should have. Daniel overheard part of the conversation in the hallway. Later that evening, he knocked gently on our door. When I opened it, he explained he had a guest room and that it seemed pointless for me to waste money elsewhere. His offer was casual, almost indifferent, as if it were the most practical solution. Mark agreed immediately, relieved to cross one more problem off his list. "That's perfect," he said, already checking his emails. "Thanks, Daniel. I owe you." I searched Daniel's face for hesitation. There was none, only steady composure and something softer beneath it. "It's no trouble," he replied, though his gaze flickered briefly to mine. The morning Mark left for his trip, he kissed my cheek absently and reminded me to text if I needed anything. I watched him disappear into the elevator with a suitcase that looked heavier than our conversation. When the doors shut, the hallway felt unusually quiet. That evening, I packed an overnight bag and walked next door. The distance between our apartments was less than 10 steps, yet my pulse carried the weight of something more significant. Daniel opened the door before I could knock twice. "Hey," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His apartment smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. The space was tidy but lived in, books stacked neatly, a lamp casting warm light across the living room. It felt different from my own apartment, not because of the furniture, but because of the atmosphere. There was intention here. Daniel took my suitcase and set it near the guest room. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, suddenly aware of how quiet the evening was, how unoccupied the air felt without Mark's distracted presence. Standing in Daniel's doorway, I sensed the fragile line I was about to test, not crossed, not yet, but visible. I told myself it was just a temporary arrangement. Just a few nights. Just convenience. But as Daniel closed the door behind me, The sound echoed longer than it should have. The first night in Daniel Reed's apartment began with careful distance. Ethan Parker placed his bag in the guest room and told himself this was practical, nothing more. Daniel kept the door to his own bedroom slightly ajar, a silent reassurance of boundaries. The apartment felt quieter than Ethan expected, as if the walls were waiting to see what he would do inside them. They settled in the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee neither of them truly needed. The conversation stayed neutral at first: work schedules, the plumbing repairs, the inconvenience of adulthood. But neutrality with Daniel never lasted long. He had a way of asking questions that peeled gently rather than pried. "Do you miss him when he travels?" Daniel asked, leaning against the counter. Ethan knew who he meant. "Of course," he replied automatically. Daniel didn't challenge the answer. He simply held Ethan's gaze, steady and patient, as if giving him space to amend it. Ethan exhaled. "I miss who he used to be when he travels," he corrected quietly. Daniel nodded once, not in judgment but in understanding. That subtle validation unsettled Ethan more than disagreement would have. Mark Sullivan rarely asked about emotional nuance, he preferred solutions to feelings. Daniel, by contrast, lingered in them. They moved to the living room when the coffee cooled. A soft rain tapped against the windows, enclosing the space in an intimacy Ethan hadn't anticipated. They sat on opposite ends of the couch at first, separated by a cushion that felt symbolic. Daniel spoke about his own breakup, carefully, without dramatics. He admitted he had ignored warning signs because the relationship felt safe. "Comfort can trick you," he said. "It convinces you that silence means peace." Ethan felt that sentence settle uncomfortably in his chest. Silence had defined his relationship with Mark for months. Arguments required energy, and neither of them seemed willing to spend it anymore. "You ever think you stayed too long?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "but leaving felt like admitting I'd been wrong." The honesty between them was unforced, and that frightened Ethan. With Mark, vulnerability often turned into problem-solving or deflection. With Daniel, vulnerability was allowed to exist without being fixed. The rain intensified, and a brief flicker of lightning dimmed the lights before the power cut out entirely. The apartment plunged into darkness, followed by a low hum of city generators in the distance. Daniel laughed softly. Perfect timing. He retrieved 2 candles from a drawer and lit them on the coffee table. The flames cast shifting shadows across his face, softening the sharp angles Ethan had noticed before. In the warm glow, the room felt smaller. They sat closer now, not intentionally, but because the candlelight pulled them inward. Ethan became acutely aware of Daniel's presence, the warmth of his shoulder a few inches away, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Awareness replaced comfort. "Does he know you're unhappy?" Daniel asked quietly. Ethan swallowed. "I don't think he realizes it's that serious." "And you?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know when it became serious." That admission felt heavier than anything he had said so far. It wasn't just dissatisfaction, it was uncertainty. Daniel studied him with an expression that held neither pity nor desire, only recognition. "You deserve to feel chosen," Daniel said finally. The words were simple, but they struck with precision. Ethan couldn't remember the last time someone framed love that way. Mark chose deadlines, opportunities, advancement. Ethan often felt like something assumed rather than selected. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged. A draft moved through the room, and Ethan shivered despite the warmth. Daniel noticed. Without thinking, he reached for a folded blanket draped over the armrest and placed it around Ethan's shoulders. His fingers brushed Ethan's collarbone briefly before pulling back. The contact lasted less than a second, yet it altered the air between them. Ethan's pulse quickened, not from surprise but from recognition. He didn't move away. Daniel didn't apologize. Instead, they sat in the quiet glow of candlelight, the space between them reduced to inches rather than cushions. Ethan told himself this was harmless, 2 adults sharing conversation during a storm. But the truth pulsed beneath that excuse. He felt seen, and he had missed that feeling more than he realized. Somewhere down the street, power flickered back to life, and light flooded the room without warning. The sudden brightness exposed their proximity. Daniel shifted slightly, creating space again. "We should probably call it a night," he said, his voice controlled. Ethan nodded, though part of him resisted the interruption. He stood, the blanket slipping from his shoulders, and moved toward the guest room. At the doorway, he paused. "Daniel," he began, unsure what he intended to say. Daniel met his eyes. "Thank you," Ethan finished, though gratitude wasn't the only thing he felt. Daniel gave a faint smile. "Good night, Ethan." Ethan closed the guest room door gently, but sleep didn't come easily. In the quiet darkness, he replayed every word, every glance, every almost touch. Across the apartment, separated by a wall too thin for comfort, Daniel remained awake as well. Neither of them had crossed a line. Not yet. Ethan Parker woke to the muted sound of movement in the kitchen and the unfamiliar realization that he had slept better in Daniel Reed's guest room than he had in his own apartment for months. The thought unsettled him before he even opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night with careful precision. Nothing inappropriate had happened. No promises had been made. No boundaries had been clearly broken. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The emotional distance he maintained in his relationship with Mark Sullivan felt smaller than the space between him and Daniel now. The smell of coffee drew him from bed. Daniel stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, sunlight tracing the lines of his forearms. He looked composed, as though the candlelit intensity of the night before had been imagined. "Morning," Daniel said, glancing over his shoulder. "Morning," Ethan replied, surprised by the softness in his own voice. They fell into an easy rhythm. 2 mugs, 2 plates, a quiet exchange of sugar and cutlery. The simplicity of the scene carried a weight Ethan didn't want to name. There was no urgency, no distraction, no phone buzzing in Daniel's hand. Mark's mornings usually began with emails and half-listened responses. Daniel's attention, by contrast, was undivided. "You look like you didn't sleep much," Daniel observed gently. Ethan hesitated, then chose honesty. "I was thinking about everything." Daniel nodded as if that answer required no further clarification. They ate at the small kitchen table facing each other. The conversation drifted naturally toward relationships again, but this time the tone felt less reflective and more immediate. "Do you still love him?" Daniel asked carefully. The question landed without accusation, but it demanded truth. Ethan stared down at his coffee. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love who we were. I don't know if I love who we are." Daniel absorbed that quietly. "There's a difference," he said. "Yes," Ethan replied, meeting his eyes. "There is." The space between them tightened, not physically at first, but emotionally. Daniel wasn't trying to persuade him of anything. That restraint made the moment more powerful. He wasn't competing with Mark, he was simply present in a way Mark no longer was. After breakfast, they moved to the living room under the pretense of checking the news about the plumbing repairs. Ethan sat on the couch, Daniel took the armchair opposite him. The physical distance felt intentional, almost cautious. "I don't want to complicate your life," Daniel said suddenly. Ethan looked up. "I know you're with someone," Daniel continued. "And I respect that, but I won't pretend I don't feel this." The honesty was steady, not dramatic. It left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan's heart pounded, not from surprise, but from relief. The unspoken tension had finally been given language. "You feel what?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. Daniel held his gaze. "I feel something real." The simplicity of the confession stripped away every excuse Ethan had prepared. This wasn't manipulation. It wasn't opportunistic. It was direct and vulnerable. Ethan stood, pacing once before stopping near the window. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured. Daniel rose too, but he didn't approach. "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." That was the crucial difference. Daniel wasn't pulling him closer, he was giving him room to step back. Ethan turned toward him, conflicted. "It's not that simple." "It can be," Daniel replied softly. "You either choose what you have, or you admit it's not enough." The statement cut deeper than Ethan expected. For months, he had avoided framing his relationship with Mark in such clear terms. Staying had been easier than deciding. "My boyfriend is coming home tomorrow," Ethan said, as if the reminder could restore order. Daniel nodded. "Then you should be sure before he does." Silence thickened the room. Ethan could feel the weight of his own indecision pressing against him. He thought of Mark's distracted goodbye, of cancelled dinners and unfinished conversations. He thought of how invisible he had felt standing in his own kitchen. And then he looked at Daniel, present, patient, honest. Daniel took a single step forward, closing only part of the distance. "I don't want to be the reason you betray someone," he said quietly. "But I won't deny what I feel either." The air between them felt electric. Ethan's voice faltered. "I haven't felt chosen in a long time." Daniel's expression softened. You deserve to. That was the moment the decision crystallized, not out of impulse, but out of accumulated loneliness. Ethan closed the remaining space between them. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, inches apart, breathing the same air. Daniel gave him one final chance to reconsider by not moving at all. Ethan made the choice. He reached forward first. The contact was deliberate, not rushed. It carried the weight of acknowledgement rather than recklessness. The line, once theoretical, was now undeniable. When they finally stepped apart, the silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't uncertainty anymore, it was consequence. Ethan's phone vibrated sharply in his pocket. The sudden sound fractured the moment. He pulled it out, pulse racing. A message from Mark lit up the screen. Flight got changed. I'll be home tonight instead. The words blurred for a second as reality settled heavily into place. Daniel saw the shift in Ethan's expression. What is it? Ethan swallowed, staring at the message that had arrived too soon. He's coming back, Ethan said quietly. And for the first time since stepping into Daniel's apartment, the future felt dangerously close. The message from Mark Sullivan remained on Ethan Parker's screen long after the vibration stopped. I'll be home tonight instead. The words felt less like information and more like a deadline. Daniel Reed watched him carefully, reading the tension in his posture. You should go, Daniel said, not coldly, but with quiet clarity. Ethan nodded. Staying another minute would only blur the situation further. What had just happened between them was undeniable, but so was the life waiting next door. He grabbed his jacket, his movements sharper than before. At the door, he hesitated. Daniel didn't reach for him this time. There was no attempt to soften the exit. This isn't something I regret, Daniel said steadily. But it's something you have to decide about. Ethan understood the distinction. Regret and responsibility were not the same. He stepped back into the hallway, the short distance between apartments now feeling heavier than it ever had. When he unlocked his own door, the familiar scent of his and Mark's shared space greeted him with unsettling normalcy. Nothing in the apartment reflected what had just changed. He paced the living room once, then again. The truth pressed against him from every angle. He had crossed a line. But the betrayal hadn't started with a single moment. It had begun months ago, in quiet disappointments and unspoken needs. Mark arrived just after sunset. The door opened with the same efficiency Ethan had come to expect. Mark rolled his suitcase inside, loosening his tie as he scanned the room. Hey, he said, offering a brief smile. Missed you. Ethan studied him, the familiar slope of his shoulders, the fatigue lining his expression. For a second, he saw the man he had fallen for, ambitious, driven, full of plans. But he also saw the distance that had grown between them, subtle and persistent. Your trip was supposed to last longer, Ethan said. Flight got rescheduled, Mark replied, shrugging. Didn't want to stay another night. There was a time when that sentence would have felt reassuring. Now it sounded incidental. Mark set his suitcase aside and finally seemed to notice Ethan's stillness. What's wrong? The question hung between them. Ethan realized how rarely it had been asked with genuine concern. We need to talk, Ethan said, the words steady despite the tremor in his chest. Mark's expression shifted immediately, defensiveness replacing fatigue. About what? About us. That single word altered the room. Mark sighed softly, running a hand through his hair. Ethan, I just got back. Can this wait? That's the problem, Ethan replied. Everything waits. Silence followed, but this silence was different from the ones that had defined their recent months. This one demanded resolution. Mark crossed his arms. What are you saying? Ethan chose his words carefully. This wasn't about Daniel, not entirely. I feel alone in this relationship, he said. For a long time now. Mark frowned. That's not fair. I work hard for us. I know, Ethan said gently. But I don't need you to work harder. I need you to be here. The simplicity of that truth seemed to catch Mark off guard. I thought you understood, Mark said. This is temporary. Once I get this promotion. There's always something after that, Ethan interrupted quietly. Another project. Another goal. Mark looked away first. So what? You're unhappy. Ethan felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing against him. He could confess the full truth, about Daniel, about the line crossed. But he understood something now, the emotional fracture had existed long before that moment. Yes, Ethan answered honestly. I am. The admission stripped away any remaining illusion. Mark's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, Ethan said. You just didn't hear me. The accusation wasn't cruel, it was weary. For a long moment, neither spoke. The apartment felt smaller, the shared furniture less permanent. So what are you saying? Mark asked again, this time without defensiveness. Ethan inhaled slowly. I'm saying this isn't working. And I think we both know it. Mark's shoulders dropped slightly, as though some unspoken truth had finally been acknowledged. There was no dramatic argument, no raised voices, only the quiet realization that love, when unattended, erodes. You're ending it, Mark said. Ethan nodded. I'm choosing to stop pretending. The words hurt, but they also steadied him. For the first time in months, his decision felt active rather than reactive. Mark looked around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time. I didn't think we were this far gone. We've been far for a while, Ethan replied. The conversation that followed was practical, logistics, timelines, the division of a life once intertwined. Each sentence felt like the careful removal of something once essential. When the discussion ended, Mark retreated to the bedroom, closing the door with restrained finality. Ethan remained in the living room, alone. He didn't reach for his phone immediately. He didn't run next door. Instead, he allowed himself to sit in the quiet and acknowledge what he had done, not just with Daniel, but with his own truth. Hours later, when he finally stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. He paused outside Daniel's door but didn't knock. Whatever happened next would not be born from secrecy or escape. It would have to be built deliberately. Ethan exhaled slowly, understanding that crossing one line had forced him to confront many others. And this time, he intended to choose openly.